Hi everybody, welcome to the fifth in our House Percival Housing Snapshot webinar series. Many apologies for last week's cancellation and thank you for joining me again this week. This week you just got me. I'm Estelle Corner and I'm head of the social housing team here at House Percival. Couple of things to cover off before we begin. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the webinar. So if you'd like to ask anything, put it in the Q&A box. And if there's any technical difficulties at any stage, let us know using the chat function and we'll try and help. Today, I am back to a couple of my favourite affordable home ownership topics, and I'm going to be looking at two different areas of shared ownership. First, the government recently published guidance for tenants on the new right to shared ownership. So I'm going to be looking at the basics of that right and what RPs need to know. And I'll also be looking at the basic, oh, sorry, I've done that bit, the basics of the procedure. Second, I'm going to be looking at the All Party Parliamentary Group inquiry report, which was published in January last year, about making retirement living affordable and the role of shared ownership housing for older people. Go look at some of the themes that came out of that inquiry report. I realised once I started prepping this webinar that I could probably talk about both of these topics for hours, but we have only got 30 minutes as usual, and I'm going to try and leave some time for Q&A. If there's anything in this that you think would merit a bit more detail, another webinar, please let me know in the feedback form at the end, and we can try and factor that into future webinars. So, right to shared ownership, first of all. I'm going to have a look at what right to shared ownership is and have a high-level review of the procedures. Now, some RPs out there might be thinking, well, we don't do shared ownership, so we don't need to know about this. But if you have got any grant-funded affordable rent or social rent homes under the new Homes England funding programme 21 to 26, you are going to have to get your heads around shared ownership. And even if you don't, you might still be getting inquiries from tenants that you'll need to know how you're going to answer those. Right to shared ownership is a feature of the Affordable Homes Programme 21 to 26, and it really comes off the back of those government promises to get more people into home ownership. It's back in the sector spotlight at the moment because in December last year, the Department for Levelling Up published its guide for tenants and the full right to shared ownership application form. The initial guidance for RPs came out in September 2020, and that was pretty scant on detail. I'm going to look at some of this in more detail, but the basic premise of right to shared ownership is that eligible tenants may acquire an eligible home on new model shared ownership terms. The eligibility criteria are much like right to acquire, but unlike right to acquire, where the eligible tenants have a statutory right to acquire their home, right to shared ownership is a contractual obligation on RPs, and it's a grant funding condition that is found in RP's Homes England grant funding agreements. Also, unlike right to acquire, there is no discount. The price that the tenant will pay for their share of the home is based on market value. Also worth noting that unlike traditional shared ownership, there is a Homes England grant recovery on the first tranche sale. Going to take a look now at how right to shared ownership is going to work in practice. The requirements and obligations on RPs are divided across the Tenants Guide, the initial guidance to RPs, the Capital Funding Guide, and grant funding agreements. So not ideal. I think the easiest place to look for now is the Tenants Guide, because this sets out 8 steps to acquiring a home under right to shared ownership. The first step is for the tenant to contact its landlord to register its interest. And this is going to be most relevant to RPs now. So if a tenant contacts you to register an interest, you have to write back to the tenant within 4 weeks to confirm whether their home is eligible or not for right to shared ownership. And if it's not eligible, You have to explain why it isn't and give your internal complaints or disputes procedure in case they want to complain and dispute your decision. So how do you work out if a property is eligible? I'd say there's 2 steps to this. Firstly, is the home in scope? And then is it exempt? Homes that are in scope are social and affordable rented homes, grant funded through the Affordable Homes Programme 21 to 26, except where an exemption applies, and we'll come on to those. So that may include nil grant funded rented homes that are part of a funded scheme, but it won't include homes that are delivered through Section 106 agreements. There's another limb to this, which is slightly buried, but it can be found in more detail in grant agreements, is that right to shared ownership also applies to homes that are funded with recycled grant from the Affordable Homes Programme. So you've established that your property is in scope. You then have to look at whether it's exempt. So any local authorities are going to be pleased to know that their homes are automatically out of scope, as are community land trusts, cooperative HAs. The other exemptions will be familiar from right to acquire, things like designated protected areas, rural exemption sites, specialist homes for older, disabled and vulnerable people, and almshouses, all exempt. Cost floor will also be familiar. So that's the thing where if the current market value is less than the home cost, you can treat it as exempt. And in addition, there's an exceptional exemption. The examples given for the exceptional exemption are insufficient legal interest, interference with regeneration plans, requires substantial repairs and remediation. For homes that are exempt through cost floor and exceptional exemption, RPs should be offering tenants the option of accessing shared ownership on a similar property. In fact, the Capital Funding Guide goes a bit further than that and says that RPs should be offering alternatives where a home is exempt for any reason. So you've established the property is eligible. You then need to send the tenant an application form. And then we move on to step 2. The tenant completes the application form and you have 8 weeks to respond on that, having checked the tenant's eligibility. So how do you establish if the tenant is eligible? I've put a summary on the screen of the eligibility requirements. A lot of this is familiar from right to acquire, but I've highlighted the key differences. Obviously, the home has to be eligible for right to shared ownership, but also the tenant has to have been living in that home for at least 12 months. The tenant has to meet the shared ownership eligibility requirements, and that's going to include the income requirement, which is currently the gross household income of 80,000 or less outside of London and not already own a property. And they have to be otherwise unable to buy a suitable home on the open market. As an RP, if you're doing shared ownership anyway, you're going to have procedures in place for checking eligibility of tenants, so this should all be familiar to you. So you've checked that the home's eligible, you've checked that the tenant's eligible. What happens next? So you move on to step 3, which is a home ownership meeting between the landlord and the tenant to discuss how right to shared ownership and shared ownership works, including discussion of long-term financial and legal responsibilities. You then go on to step 4, which is the detailed affordability assessment. And again, if you already do shared ownership, you'll be familiar with the procedures for doing that. It's only after that affordability assessment that, quite strangely, you do the formal valuation. Once you've got the formal valuation, you do a formal offer notice to the tenant, which is subject to contract. The tenant then decides whether or not to accept that offer. And then the final step for you, step 8, the memorandum of sale, which is where you instruct the lawyers to do the contract and shared ownership lease. So to recap on right to shared ownership, it's going to apply to grant-funded rented homes under the Affordable Homes Programme 21 to 26. There's no discount for tenants, but this is a right, and I've put a right in quote marks because it's a contractual obligation rather than a statutory right, but a right to a shared ownership lease on new model terms. You're not going to see many of these coming through yet, partly because the houses are only starting to come through under the new funding programme, and then you've got the 12-month residency requirement, but you might start seeing inquiries coming in. So you're going to have to be briefing your teams on how to respond to those initial inquiries and in due course, how to respond to the full applications. There's also an issue around publicising right to shared ownership. There's something in the guidance that says that landlords are expected to publicise that this right exists. The tenant guide actually goes further and says that landlords should be notifying tenants proactively if right to shared ownership applies to their home. So this might be something that RPs want to think about putting in annual rent letters in the future, perhaps. And again, finally, grant recovery, that initial tranche is subject to grant recovery, unlike on normal shared ownership. So that's a few pointers on right to shared ownership, really just a headline review in the time available. As I say, if it would be helpful to have a webinar that goes into more detail on it, please let me know in the feedback form. Moving on now to take a look at the recent inquiry report on the role of shared ownership housing for older people, published by the All Party Parliamentary Group on Housing and Care for Older People. I'll do a quick recap on what OPSO is, look at the main conclusions of the report, and then pick out some of the key recommendations coming out of the inquiry related to consumer protection, information and awareness, and the shared ownership funding programme. A bit of background on all party parliamentary groups. So APPGs are informal cross-party groups with no official status within Parliament. They're run by and for members of the House of Commons and Lords, although they may involve individuals and organisations from outside Parliament. In this case, the APPG, the co-chairs are Lord Best, who's a cross-bench member of the House of Lords, and Peter Aldous MP, who's the Conservative MP for Waveney. And this particular inquiry was supported by Housing 21. What is older people's shared ownership? There are some private older people's shared ownership schemes, but in the context of Homes England grant-funded schemes, OPSO is like normal shared ownership, but with a few differences. Firstly, it's restricted to leaseholders who are aged over 55. Staircasing is capped at 75%, as is the initial tranche purchase. No rent is payable once you've staircased to 75%. And the lease has to provide for access to person-centred services, which might be an on-site warden, it might be some other call system or access to 24/7 emergency care. New model shared ownership lease terms may apply depending on the funding programme. So anything funded under the 21 to 26 programme, you will have new model shared ownership, say 990-year term, the 10-year repair holiday, 1% staircasing, that sort of thing. So this inquiry, the APPG took evidence from shared owners, from Department of Levelling Up, from Homes England, housing providers, academics, various other experts. And they came to two main conclusions. Firstly, that there is considerable potential demand for OPSO, particularly for the squeezed middle and right sizes, but the current OPSO arrangements are not robust enough. There's too much complexity and uncertainty over costs. There's not enough consumer protection, and there are anomalies in grant arrangements. So when they were talking about the squeezed middle, what they meant there was people who've got enough equity in their current homes to buy a shared ownership home at 75%, but not enough to afford a private retirement home. There isn't a great deal of data available on OPSO, but the anecdotal evidence to the inquiry was that the majority of purchases are at the 75% level. So there is no rent payable, often no mortgage. And this creates challenges for providers because of the lack of rental income. According to the inquiry, there are currently around 20,000 OPSO properties in the country, so it is a pretty limited product at the moment. Looking at just a couple of the areas that the inquiry focused on, and first of all, information and awareness. The inquiry made the point that there is a lack of awareness around housing options for older people generally, and on top of that, shared ownership is still a niche product. Various agencies and sector bodies have tried to raise the profile of shared ownership, and local authorities, I know, have had campaigns to raise awareness of different retirement housing options. But what the conclusion the inquiry came to is that we need more of a centralised government push and for agencies and government to work together to raise awareness. And that awareness is not just for potential leaseholders, but also for providers, to encourage more providers to come into the OPSO market. The inquiry also made an interesting point about financial advice for buyers. So shared ownership buyers, we generally tend to think of them as being first-time buyers. They're getting a mortgage, so they will get financial advice from a mortgage broker. But downsizers in the OPSO market, often buying without a mortgage, won't be getting mortgage broker advice. And it can be hard for them to work out their best financial position. So the inquiry recommended that everyone involved in the sector should be seeking to ensure that good financial advice is provided to all prospective purchasers. The next area I'm looking at the report is consumer protection. The inquiry heard lots of concerns from leaseholders and prospective shared owners about hidden or escalating costs in OPSO. And it's the familiar criticism we have of shared ownership about service charges and repair costs. In KIDS, the key information documents have been an attempt to address that in mainstream shared ownership. Interestingly, the inquiry found that people want more information on charges projected into the future, like the old Help to Buy equity charge projections. But that's clearly tricky with service charges because they are variable. The inquiry did hear about some perhaps more creative approaches to service charges. For example, Notting Hill Genesis, who offer OPSO leases where they put 0.5% of the property value each year into a sinking fund for long-term repair costs. The other cost challenge for OPSO leaseholders, which is not mentioned quite so much in the report, is the care cost. Individual care costs will be separate to the lease costs, but those escalating costs to the individual are another financial burden. And there will also be costs in the lease for the person-centred services, and that cost can be off-putting to prospective leaseholders, particularly if they are buying at a time when they don't have a care need, but have an anticipated care need for the future. Also in the area of consumer protection, the report touched on the poor reputation in the retirement housing sector. And there's a quote on the screen there from the report talking about the risk of rogue players in the market undermining trust in the whole sector. And there has been some pretty bad press for some retirement home providers, some who might be owned by offshore private equity, have high ground rents, high service charges, high administration costs, exit fees, difficulties with resales. And that sort of negative publicity impacts trust in the whole kind of retirement home ownership sector. In the report, there is a case study on an unnamed for-profit RP. I haven't got time to go into detail on it here, but it is worth reading about some of the things that can go wrong and how reputations can be put at risk. So you've got all of that, costs and service charges, poor reputation, on top of the toxic leasehold narrative that we know from shared ownership. And the government's not really helping there after Gove's statement in January that leasehold must be abolished. That's really not helpful if you're trying to build confidence in shared ownership as a product. But anyway, politics aside, the recommendations from the inquiry were more information on service charges and repair costs, a consumer code, consultation on legal and regulatory options to strengthen consumer rights, mention of the leasehold reform, which should outlaw poor practices. I'll preserve my position on that, and regulation of private property agents. Now, I know that the last thing RPs want at the moment is yet more regulation, But I do think that if more for-profit RPs or private sector come into affordable retirement homes, then there needs to be more robust consumer protection and standards around costs and fees. And perhaps until we get there, HAs providing OPSO are in a really good position to use their reputation and charitable status to build trust in the sector. And that, with some guidance from Homes England, might give confidence to HAs who are new to the sector and want to come into it. Before we move on to the final bit on this, a little quiz question, check you're awake. So we know at 75% equity, a leaseholder pays no rent on the remaining 25%. But if a leaseholder owns 70% equity, how much of the remaining equity do they pay rent on? So hopefully that's come up on your screen now. 5%, 25%, or 30%? This is very interesting because I can see the responses on screen, and just about, so just about the majority have gone for the right answer, which is 30%. Now, this does come across as a bit unfair, and we'll look at that in this final section. So the inquiry looked at the shared ownership programme itself, and it considered in some detail concerns about the fairness of what I'll call this 75% rent cliff. So as we've seen, a leaseholder at 70% pays 30% rent, but a leaseholder at 75% pays nothing. So the recommendation from the inquiry was that that 25% rent subsidy applies whatever percentage is bought. And that's clearly not going to be attractive to housing associations unless it is grant funded. And that is what the inquiry recommended. The inquiry also heard that limited providers partner with Homes England for OPSO. And one of the reasons was because of this rent-free element at 75%, making schemes unviable. So the inquiry recommended more generous grant settlements. Now, I don't think any RP is going to kind of argue with increased grant funding for OPSO schemes. There's a lot more in that report that is worth reading, and I don't have time to cover it now, but I would really recommend reading the full report if you are doing OPSO already, or it's something you are thinking about getting involved in. So that is what I have got for today. So a little bit of time left for Q&A. Let's have a look and see if there are any questions. If you've got any, please do put them in. Let's have a look. Oh, kids and right to shared ownership, key information documents and rights to shared ownership. Do you need to use the kids? I haven't seen anything in the right to shared ownership guides and documents specifically about using key information documents, but I guess if you're working off the principles of the capital funding guide that key information documents have to be used for all grant funded shared ownership, then yes, key information documents also need to be used for right to shared ownership. That's an interesting point. See if there's any other questions here. Recycled capital grant funding as an eligibility for property to be purchased through right to shared ownership. So yes, that's in the in the grant funding agreements. It does make it clear that if you are using recycled capital grant fund from the Affordable Homes Programme 21 to 26 and putting that into new rented housing, then the right to shared ownership kind of travels along with the grant funding. So the right to shared ownership attaches to that grant funding and will attach to a building, to a home that is built with the recycled capital grant funding. So we'll pass along. There might be a bit more detail to come out about that. But I think it's going to be very important to kind of keep track on all your homes exactly where the funding has come from, so you can know quite quickly if asked whether or not right to shared ownership does apply or not. Let's see, any other questions? Right to shared ownership and excuse me, the repair concessions in new model shared ownership. So new model shared ownership will apply to right to shared ownership. So you'll get the 1% staircasing, and that will apply for the 15 years from completion of the right to shared ownership lease. But the 10-year repair holiday, that 10-year period runs not from completion of the lease on right to shared ownership, but from build completion. So let's say someone claims right to shared ownership 5 years after the home was built, then they will only get 5 years of that repairs concession in the shared ownership lease. If they buy the home after 10 years, they won't get any of that at all, and they will immediately be responsible for 100% of the repairing costs. I think that's all for the questions for now. If you do come up with any others, please do kind of give me a shout. We will send everyone a copy of the slides. At the end of the webinar, I said there will be a feedback form. If you could fill that in, that is really helpful to us for planning future webinars. If you've got any queries about any of the topics we covered today, please don't hesitate to get in contact with me. And in the meantime, we hope you'll join us again for our next webinar. Thank you.